Story 1. The Deep Waters Whisper. I packed up my gear and left the lake that day, vowing never to return. Whatever was in that water, it wasn't something I wanted to face again. The quiet stillness of the lake had unnerved me in a way that was difficult to describe, but the thing that really pushed me over the edge was the whisper. The faint, almost inaudible sound that seemed to echo from the depths of the lake, like a voice calling out from beneath the water. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that it was just the wind, or maybe the rustling of the trees, but deep down, I knew better. It all started early that morning, when I arrived at the lake for what I thought would be a peaceful day of fishing. The place was remote, miles away from the nearest road, and the water was so clear that I could see all the way to the bottom near the shore. It was the perfect spot for a quiet day away from the stress of the world. I set up my gear, cast my line, and settled in for what I thought would be an uneventful day. For the first few hours, everything was normal. The sun was shining, the water was calm, and I was completely alone. But as the afternoon wore on, a strange feeling began to creep over me. The air around the lake grew still, unnaturally so. The birds that had been chirping in the trees went silent, and even the wind seemed to stop. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the shore, but even that seemed muted, like the entire lake was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that it was just my imagination, but the unease only grew stronger. That's when I heard the whisper. At first, it was so faint that I thought it was just the wind. A soft, almost melodic sound that seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of the water. But as I sat there, listening, the whisper grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice coming from beneath the water. I stood up, looking out across the lake, but there was no one there. No boats, no other fishermen, just me and the silent, still water. I walked closer to the edge of the lake, trying to listen more carefully, but as soon as I did, the whisper stopped. I stood there for a moment, staring down into the water, my heart pounding in my chest. The water was so clear that I could see all the way to the bottom, where smooth stones lay undisturbed by the current. But there was something else down there, something deeper. A shadow, dark and indistinct, moving just beneath the surface. I blinked, and the shadow was gone. I stepped back, my skin crawling with a sudden chill despite the warmth of the afternoon. I knew then that I needed to leave, that whatever was in that lake wasn't something I wanted to mess with. But before I could turn away, the whisper returned. It was louder this time, clearer, and it sent a shiver down my spine. It sounded like a woman's voice, soft and haunting, calling out from beneath the water. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a plea, a cry for help. Against my better judgment, I leaned down, peering into the water once again. The surface was perfectly still, but as I watched, the shadow returned. It was closer now, just beneath the surface, moving slowly toward me. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and the whisper grew louder, more urgent. I grabbed my gear, throwing it into my backpack as quickly as I could. I needed to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, something caught my ankle, something cold and slimy, like a hand wrapping around my leg. I looked down, and to my horror, I saw a pale, ghostly hand emerging from the water, its fingers long and bony, gripping my ankle with an unnatural strength. I screamed, kicking at the hand, but it wouldn't let go. The whisper had become a scream now, echoing in my ears, a desperate, inhuman wail that filled me with a terror I had never known. With one last frantic kick, I broke free and scrambled away from the water, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was back at my truck, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I drove away, I glanced back at the lake one last time, and for a split second I saw her. Standing at the edge of the water, her pale, ghostly figure barely visible in the fading light. Her eyes were dark, hollow pits, and her mouth hung open in a silent scream. I never went back to that lake. Whatever was in the water that day, it was something unnatural, something that should have stayed buried in the depths. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I can still hear that whisper, calling to me from the deep. Story 2. The Shadow Beneath the Dock. I had been fishing on that dock for years. It was a quiet spot, tucked away on a remote part of the lake that hardly anyone knew about. It was the kind of place where you could cast your line, kick back, and forget about the world. But after what happened last summer, I haven't been back, and I doubt I ever will. It was a hot, sticky afternoon when I decided to head down to the dock for some peace and quiet. The sun was high, and the air was thick with humidity. The water lapped gently against the posts of the old wooden dock, and the trees surrounding the lake provided just enough shade to make the heat bearable. It was the perfect day for fishing. I set up my gear, cast my line, and settled into my usual spot at the end of the dock. The lake was calm, the water clear, and for the first hour or so, everything was exactly as it had always been. But then, something changed. I noticed it first in the way the water shifted. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, but as I watched, the gentle ripples on the surface began to fade, leaving the water eerily still. The birds, which had been chirping in the trees, went silent, and the familiar sounds of the forest seemed to disappear. An uneasy feeling settled over me, like the world had suddenly gone quiet, waiting for something to happen. I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to the heat, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I looked down into the water, hoping to catch a glimpse of fish swimming beneath the surface, but what I saw instead made my blood run cold. There was something down there, something big, moving slowly beneath the dock. It wasn't a fish, at least not any kind I'd ever seen. It was too large, too dark, and its movements were too deliberate. I could only see its shadow, a massive, dark shape gliding silently through the water, just out of view. For a moment, I froze, unsure of what to do. My first thought was that it must have been some kind of large fish, maybe a sturgeon or a catfish, but deep down, I knew better. The shadow was too long, too unnatural, and it didn't swim like any fish I'd ever seen. It moved with purpose, as if it knew exactly where it was going. Then I felt that the dock trembled beneath my feet, a low, almost imperceptible vibration, like something was brushing against the posts below. I stood up, my heart racing, and backed away from the edge. My line, which had been sitting motionless in the water, suddenly went taut, the rod bending sharply as if something had taken the bait. I grabbed the rod instinctively, but as soon as I touched it, the line snapped, the force nearly pulling me off the dock and into the water. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, and stared down at the broken line in disbelief. That's when I saw it. Rising up from the depths, just beneath the surface of the water, was a face. Pale, distorted, with wide, empty eyes that stared up at me from the darkness. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched tightly over a bony frame, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque, silent scream. The thing's head emerged slowly, its long, skeletal fingers grasping the edge of the dock as it pulled itself closer. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the spot, my mind unable to process the horror of what I was seeing. The thing kept rising, its body impossibly long and thin, its eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my blood turn to ice. And then it whispered. I didn't hear the words so much as feel them, an eerie, bone-chilling sound that seemed to vibrate through the air, filling my head with a sense of dread unlike anything I had ever experienced. The creature's mouth moved slowly, forming words that I couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear. It wanted me. Without thinking, I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the wooden planks as I sprinted back toward the shore. I didn't look back, didn't dare glance over my shoulder to see if it was following me. All I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, the blood rushing in my ears, and the faint, lingering whisper of that voice in my mind. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear inside and sped off, not stopping until I was miles away from that cursed lake. My hands were shaking, my heart still racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how many times I replayed it in my mind, the only thing that made sense was that something unnatural was in that lake, something that had been waiting for me beneath the dock. I haven't been back since. I don't think I ever will. Every time I drive past the lake, I can feel its pull, the strange, unsettling whisper that seems to follow me wherever I go. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that there's something in that water, something dark, something ancient, and it's still waiting. Story 3. The Lure in the Marsh. It had been years since I'd last gone fishing with my brother, so when he called me up one weekend and suggested we head out to the marshlands, I couldn't resist. The marsh wasn't exactly the most inviting place to fish. It was isolated, overgrown with thick reeds, and full of murky, brackish water, but it was our favorite spot growing up, and I figured it'd be a nice way to relive some childhood memories. We arrived at the marsh just before dawn, the early morning fog hanging low over the water. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and decaying plants, and the only sounds were the occasional croak of a frog and the buzz of insects. The marsh was still quiet, almost too quiet for my liking. We set up our gear at the edge of a narrow, winding creek that snaked through the heart of the marsh. The water was dark, nearly black, and I couldn't see more than a few inches below the surface. My brother, Jake, didn't seem to mind. He cast his line into the water with a grin, clearly excited to be back in familiar territory. But from the moment we arrived, I felt uneasy. There was something off about the place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't just the silence or the fog, it was the way the marsh seemed to be watching us, like we were trespassing on something that didn't want us there. Jake noticed my discomfort and laughed it off, teasing me for being paranoid. "It's just the marsh, man," he said, slapping me on the back. "We've fished here 100 times before. You're just out of practice." I tried to shake off the feeling and cast my line, settling into the rhythm of fishing. But as the minutes turned into hours, the unease only grew stronger. The marsh felt different, darker, more oppressive, and every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of something moving just below the surface of the water. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. The first sign that something was wrong came when Jake's line suddenly went taut. He stood up, excited, thinking he'd caught something big. The rod bent under the strain, the line pulling sharply as whatever was on the other end fought back with surprising force. "Must be a monster catfish," Jake said, grinning as he struggled to reel it in. But as I watched, I saw something in the water, a shadow, long and sinuous, moving just beneath the surface. "Jake," I said, my voice trembling, "that's not a fish." He didn't hear me, too focused on reeling in his catch. The line pulled harder, and Jake was nearly dragged into the water. He planted his feet, his muscles straining as he fought against whatever was down there. Then the water erupted. A massive shape broke through the surface, sending a spray of water into the air. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. The creature was long, its body covered in dark, slimy scales that glistened in the weak sunlight. Its head was elongated with sharp, jagged teeth that jutted out from its gaping mouth. But what terrified me the most were its eyes, cold, black and intelligent, like it knew exactly what it was doing. Jake screamed as the creature yanked on the line, pulling him closer to the water. I ran to him, grabbing onto his arm and pulling with all my strength, but it was no use. The creature was too strong. "Cut the line," I shouted, panicking as the thing pulled him closer to the edge. But Jake was frozen, his eyes wide with fear as he stared at the creature thrashing in the water. Its massive body writhed and twisted, sending waves crashing against the shore. I fumbled for my knife, my hands shaking as I tried to cut the line, but before I could, the creature lunged. It happened so fast. One moment, Jake was standing beside me, struggling to hold onto his rod. The next, he was gone, dragged into the water by the creature. I screamed his name, diving toward the edge of the creek, but all I saw were ripples and bubbles rising to the surface. I plunged my hands into the water, searching blindly for him, but there was nothing. The water was too dark, too murky, and whatever had taken him was already gone, disappearing into the depths of the marsh. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The marsh was silent again, the water still as if nothing had happened. But Jake was gone, swallowed whole by the marsh and the thing that lurked beneath its surface. I waited for hours, hoping he'd resurface, hoping it had all been a nightmare. But as the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened, I knew the truth. The marsh had taken him, and it wasn't going to give him back. I never told anyone what really happened that day. The official story is that Jake drowned, pulled under by a strong current. But I know the truth. I know what I saw, and I know that something lives in that marsh, waiting, lurking beneath the water. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear it, the faint, slithering sound of something moving through the reeds, the whisper of the marsh calling me back. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.